Just by way of introduction, the last few weeks, we've seen a number of things which are quite contradictory when you place them against each other, which show the continuing politicization of the question of sexuality, which is something which we might think, or might like to think, would be personal, private, so long as it doesn't harm anybody else. Why is it publicly criticized, discussed, or even repressed? A number of things, contradictory things, which have shown why there is still very much the question of the politics of sexuality, the oppression of sexuality, and therefore the question of sexual liberation. On the one hand, you have the government of Uganda, an extremely reactionary government, through the parliament passes a law which says that there is the death penalty for aggravated homosexuality. I'm not quite sure what the aggravation element of it is, but you get the gist of where that's going. You have a public prosecutor in the north of Italy who applies to strike out the birth certificates of 33 children of lesbian couples in order that the non-biological mother, in other words, the mother who has not given birth, is removed from the birth certificate. You have that on the one hand. On the other, you have one of the world's largest manufacturers of death, Lockheed Martin, proudly saying that some of its workers have gone on a pride parade, I think in San Francisco, with the company logo and a rainbow flag. And you have, of course, the Metropolitan Police, who are being roundly denounced way beyond the usual suspects, as it were, for homophobia, misogyny, and ineradicable racism, turning up to the London Pride. So you have all of this going on in terms of the politics of sexuality. Now, I think just looking quickly at the meeting, I think quite a lot of the people here were at Elaine's meeting last week, which kind of kicked off our series. And I just want to summarize very briefly, extremely briefly, what Elaine was saying about women's oppression and gender, because of course it is integral to the question of the politics of sexuality, homophobia, anti-LGBT oppression, and so on. Put simply, without women's oppression, I think it would be very difficult to conceive of the repression and of the political questions around sexuality that we have today. What Elaine took us through was how it was, why it was that women who are not necessarily oppressed throughout the history of the human species, tens of thousands of years, became oppressed through the same process or at the same time and through interlocking processes that gave rise to a ruling class able to monopolize a sustained surplus, in other words, producing above and beyond what was necessary for that human group to survive week to week or month to month. A ruling class, a sustained surplus, private property, a state with repressive powers and ideologies in order to justify themselves and priesthoods and what have you. And all of this entwined with the rise of women's oppression as part of the passing on of private property, and therefore women initially becoming, in a sense, property of men themselves. I put that in the most incredibly brief way, because I don't want to go through the whole thing. And all of that is, there's considerable debate about it. We may want to debate it in the discussion. But I say it because it's profound. This is the work of Engels and Marx in the early 1870s. It's profound because it ties together questions of state power, economic exploitation, the exploitation, oppression of women, the distortions of sexuality and the lack of freedom in each of our lives, in a way which is connected with the material development of society. So therefore it has a history. It's not just a history of how we think about these things, it's a history about the way that human beings have come together at different, in different times and with different mechanisms in order to, as it's put in the preface to The Origin of the Family, Private Property of the State by Frederick Engels, to the social production and social reproduction. This is the basic idea, not just of Marx, but of a lot of other people, including people who have different assessments and in some ways are quite antagonistic to Marx. And for that, we have to thank, really, the modern gay and women's liberation movement erupting in the late 1960s and early 1970s. I'll say a couple of things in a moment, not in great detail, about earlier struggles and movements, but it's really here that we have a very important rupture with capitalism, which unfortunately was then reincorporated into capitalism, but a major revolutionary wave of hope around the world, a part of which, an important part of which, was women's liberation and gay liberation. There'd been resistance in the United States prior to 1969 to police raids on gay bars. There'd been a semi-public campaign, often led by people who were broadly of the left or radical liberals, for the decriminalization of homosexuality. Homosexuality criminal in the United States, as it was in Britain until 1967. 1969, you have the Stonewall riots starting the end of June of that year, and it connected with a wider radicalization. I'm not going to labor the point. It led to the birth of the Gay Liberation Front, which took the form of its name from the National Liberation Front, the struggle in Vietnam against American imperialism. You'd had not just the Black civil rights movement, but Black ghetto uprisings. You'd already had the beginnings of the women's movement, which was partially shaped by the lack of attention to the question of women's liberation in the broader movements, but crucially was an expression of the rising expectations of women in post-war Western capitalism, and not just there, coming up against restrictive norms and so on. Very, very important development. The GLF was not long-lasting, but I want to say a couple of things about what it meant in terms of theory, in terms of politics, which we need to consider today. The first thing it meant was that, not in an artificial way, you know how today people talk about, now we need to bring in the intersectional angle, now we need to bring in this angle and so on, in order to try to find a sort of from without bringing together of separate struggles. It wasn't so much like that, because in this period, 69 to let's say 75, you're talking about, amongst people who are radicalizing against the system, a general common sense backdrop that these things were all connected in some way, because you were involved in probably several of them at the same time. The question of women's liberation, the question of gay liberation, the anti-war movement, the workers' movement, certainly in Britain, and of course, the struggle against Black oppression in the United States, the movements of national liberation in the Third World. So there's a general sentiment which pulls these things together. It also meant that there was a big concern to try to understand how the question of why something so absurd as the oppression of the fact that, let's take male homosexuality, two men are attracted to each other. How on earth does this happen? Has it always happened? And for those who were certainly more socialist inclined, how is this connected to the overall structures of oppression, of the system as it was now? I don't want to prettify this and say that everybody came up with brilliant and completely convincing answers. There were all sorts of tensions, but the key thing is that people were looking to that, and central to this was the question that women's oppression and the role of women in the capitalist family, just looking at the contemporary society, the role of women in the capitalist family and their unpaid labor and pumping, that being beneficial to capitalism, meant that there was some fundamental link between all of these questions of sex and sexuality and of oppression along that axis and the capitalist system as a whole. There was also a great interest, and this goes through the 70s and into the 80s, looking back in history with some kind of materialist approach of saying, of looking at how societies developed and how there were different attitudes to sexuality and different forms, different codes of organizing gender in different societies. And I just want to say something very, very quickly about that. It was, let me just say first of all, that it was an advance upon an earlier period in the early part of the 20th century, in which there'd been scientific research into sex by what were called sexologists. It's the birth of sexology, the scientific understanding of sex and sexual relations. And it was the sexologists of the early 20th century were really quite contradictory, because on the one hand, it was an outcome of 19th century scientific thought, where everything becomes susceptible to scientific thought, which is a good thing, because suddenly you have, why shouldn't sexual relations be subject to scientific thought in the same way as anything else? That's good. The problem was that the scientific thought often didn't scientifically interrogate the basis of the society in which it was taking place. So you had lots of questions about male sexuality, how much of it is feminine, how much of it is male. And one guy, Magnus Hirschfeld, you may come across today in discussions, came up with 64 types of male sexuality, which is a suspiciously nice number for anybody who likes numbers, because it's 2 multiplied by itself 5 times. So it's this aspect of a man is male-female, that aspect is male-female, male-female, and so you keep doubling as you go on. There's absolutely no scientific rationale to it, and completely uninterrogated is the idea about why one feature, one personal aspect should be considered male and another female. So you have this, on the one hand, hyper-scientific approach, 2 times 2 times 2, etc. On the other hand, not interrogating the base of society. The good thing about the eruption of the 70s is that it led to a bit deeper investigation. And I want to return to that in a few moments as to why we need that deep interrogation today. It looked, so there was a recovery, that there was new history looking at different societies prior to capitalism and after the emergence of women's oppression that Elaine had outlined for us last week, finding different systems of gender, different ways of organizing it. I want to say a couple of things about that. The first is that when you look back at history and you find that not everybody has always thought about sex and sexuality in the same way as the orthodox conservative, and it still is quite a conservative view of today, that's useful for socialists. And in fact, in the 19th century, people found it useful. Early advocates for gay reform and legal change had found it useful that in, for example, classical Athens, a certain highly codified same-sex relation between an older man and a young adolescent boy, young man, was regarded as acceptable. People have found that useful as an argument against the strict homophobic laws and repression of the 19th and into the 20th century. Of course, because if it's in Greece, and Greece is the birthplace of Western civilization, we are told that it must be great. So these things can be useful, and they're useful also in showing that societies change over time, and not just change in kind of trivial ways, but even the quite deep ways in which human beings interact changes over time. There are some problems with the way that that's used now, however, which is often to say that because you find a society where there is a certain caste or third category between or neither male or female, that this is evidence of some essence, some way of being, which transcends all of history. And this is, I think, to do quite a lot of violence to what was the revolutionary hope and the revolutionary inspiration of a lot of the work of the 60s into the 70s, which is to say that we're not looking to project back from our own time a certain fixed idea of what it is to be a human being. We're looking at the potential of human beings in each society and the struggles of those. So, for example, I'm just going to put this very, very quickly. There is no, that you cannot look at, for example, the Bonesha, which is a social phenomenon in northern Albania, not in southern Albania, but northern Albania, of women who are called sworn virgins, who are allowed to head the family and own property. You can't look at that separate from the intense oppression of women that existed in that society. Remember, and we're talking real patriarchal oppression. I don't mean patriarchy as a synonym for women's oppression. I mean that the male head of household told everybody else what to do. So women couldn't smoke, they couldn't drink, they couldn't even wear a watch. So it's not surprising that some women, for whatever reasons, then opt out of that and find this role, this accepted exception through which the rest of the society is left unperturbed, the male-female relation and the overall oppression of sexuality. And you find this in lots and lots of societies. Maybe we can talk about it in the discussion. The point I'm making is that what ought to be good historical evidence, where we have evidence, that is an argument for liberation and against restrictive norms, can and too often the case today can be used in order to fix people more than a proper understanding of human history and of our society today will bear. And I think there's a reason for that, and the reason is in the retreat of the movements and the coming and arising from that, ideas which are conservative, even as they think that they are being quite radical. What do I mean by that? The retreat of the movement. Reason I don't have time to go into, but people, if they haven't read Chris Harman's book, The Fire Last Time, they ought to, because it is extremely good on what happened to the revolutionary movements of the 60s and the 70s, coming up against state repression and reformist deception. That's essentially what we're talking about into the 1980s. You have a legacy of people fighting for gay liberation and achieving various things. Some important legal changes thrown back in the 80s because of the AIDS crisis, but then accelerating again in the 1990s. Really quite important, you know, if you with a gay relationship, if you a lesbian couple wanting to have a legal relationship to the children and so on. These things really very, very important. And the system in the 90s into the 2000s, able to adapt to it up to a certain point. And one of the ways it was able to adapt is because of the conventionalization of the idea of sexual liberation. I mean by that, the demand, for example, for equal marriage. Now, don't get me wrong. I think if you have any laws, that they should be equally applied without discrimination against one group or another. I think that's a basic socialist position. At the same time, when it came to equal marriage, and it was brought in by the Tories. Tony Blair's government brought in civil partnership, but not equal marriage. David Cameron put it very succinctly. He said, "Well, of course, my conservative government will be in favour of gay marriage. Marriage is a conservative institution." Now, I'm not going to go around sundering happy unions in Britain and insisting on people getting divorced. But David Cameron's right that the origin of marriage is in a marriage contract, a property contract. Now, people get married for love and have happy marriages and so on. I'm not dissing that, but he's quite right that that is quite a distance from the idea of a social revolution which tears all of class society upside down, which is what the vision was. At least.
Minutes, Kevin, sorry.
Thank you, thanks, Lucy. Which is what the vision was, at least in the early 1970s. It's quite a distance from that, so that you can be gay. We can accept that. We can accept a form of that within the confines, an expanded type of conventionality. Further, capitalism is supremely brilliant at taking the residue of one wave of radicalization and repackaging that in commodified form and selling it back to people. We see this in the history of the anti-racist movement. We see it in the women's movement. We also see it in the movement for sexual liberation, for gay liberation. So you have the rise throughout the late 90s through to today of the commodification of sex and sexuality to an even greater degree, and the commodification of the idea of liberation itself. Drink this vodka, it's the cool gay thing to do. Because we've got a rainbow flag on it, it is liberation. There's also a narrowing of horizons politically within what is now no longer really a movement, but has become a series of NGOs. I'm going to give one example, which is that if you go back even 25 years ago and ask people what makes someone gay or straight, trans or whatever, most people would say that they don't know. There'd be a lot of people on the left who would give a lot of weight to the life choices that you make and your life experiences. About 20 years ago, certainly 15 years ago, this is strongly supplanted by an orthodoxy which says that you're born that way. And it is an orthodoxy which tried to seek scientific evidence, but never found it, looking for a gay gene, looking for a gay-shaped brain, looking for an association between the length of your index finger in relation to your middle finger and whether you were gay or straight. I mean, people might laugh at this, but people wrote books and managed to sell books like this 18 years ago. Now, I want to say something about that because it touches on the final point I want to make. Look, it doesn't, the key point for us is it doesn't matter what it is that makes you gay or straight, and it ought not to matter in terms of the arguments for liberation. It ought not to matter either in terms of the arguments for equality before the law. The problem is that in a period of the diminished horizons, quite conservative thinking, even as there was the expansion of gay marriage and whatever, it did matter because people were making the argument, essentially, I can't help it. We are born this way, so we should be treated, just as you can't help being black, we should be treated just like black people equally. Well, there's nothing wrong with being black, and there's nothing wrong with being gay, and there's nothing wrong with choosing to be gay. And I think that people want to have a discussion about that, about where the balance lies. My point is that the balance that was struck was not to do with any evidence or understanding of the human condition and of human liberation. It was to do with a retreat where you made a plea before a tribunal that we are born this way and therefore can't really help it. And I think there's still an awful lot of that conditioning the world today, which is kind of struck in not quite the worst of both worlds, but certainly two bad things. One is the falling apart of the liberal consensus, which was never really that much of a consensus across capitalism, but it's certainly falling apart now. And its inability to deal with the rise of all sorts of conservative arguments, which we thought we might have dispatched years ago. I mean, for me, one of the striking and most horrible things is the imprisonment of a woman for having an abortion after the time limit for 2 years under a law dating back to 1861. So we've had capitalism for 150, 160 years since then, and it's not been able to remove prison and the repressive state apparatus from the control that a woman should exercise over her own body and her fertility. So we have that on the one hand. And on the other, we have this illusion of choice powered by corporate commercialism, which doesn't really cost anything. You can slap a rainbow on anything. A CEO can put whatever pronouns they like inside their tweets or their email to you at Starbucks as they tell you that you are sacked. These things, I think, mean that we're looking at a situation today where we have all of the questions of sexual liberation. We have the period of expansion of horizons that was fought for in the 1960s, 70s, which enabled some expansion, closing in. And we have a bad set of politics, I think, on the left, which doesn't root this question firmly in social revolution, and that means a social force that can transform society as a whole. That, I would argue, means the working class. Of course, that doesn't mean that the only things that matter are strikes and what have you, but come on, it means that unless we wrest control of this system of war, of racism, of sexism, and homophobia, and transphobia, from the people who run it, then we can't really talk about a liberation, and we get lost if we end up trying to think that my expression of my individuality is the way that I'll be liberated.